Hi, everyone. Welcome. So welcome to Axios House. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our opening event here in Dubai, and you get to be here for history because this is our very first Axios event in Dubai, as well as for COP28. I'm Nyla Boodoo. I am host of the newly launched podcast, One Big Thing, which is an interview podcast that drops every Thursday morning. We have an exciting lineup for this reception as well as for all of our other events over the next 2 days. But to kick things off, we have a view from Washington and from the administration with Ali Zaidi, Special Assistant to President Joe Biden. He's on his way. Let's give him a warm welcome. How are you?
Excellent.
Thank you so much for joining us here, for leaving Expo City to come out here.
Of course. Good to be here.
So the big news from the administration and one of the biggest headlines of this COP are around the U.S. and methane, rules that were 2 years in the making around the oil and gas industry, and we're looking at a 30% reduction by 2030 of 2020 levels. Can you tell us a little bit more about those details?
Yeah, look, we've taken a big approach to methane, focusing on that source of pollution from all the places it may show up. Over the last year, the administration has taken over 100 actions to tackle methane emissions. That's everything from rules to patch up 2.7 million miles of pipeline, efforts to reduce food waste and the methane that comes out of landfills, efforts to cap mines and wells that have been abandoned and are leaking methane into the sky. And then most recently, this EPA rule, which by 2030 will result in 130 million metric tons of emissions reduction. 80% lower emission profile than would be without these rules. So this is a big deal. And what's most exciting about it, I think, is that through bold action domestically, we've been able to galvanize the rest of the world to charge ahead on methane reduction as well. 155 countries have joined the global methane pledge that President Biden launched at Glasgow 2 COPs ago.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the criticisms of this is just the details of how often recording of these emissions happens and who's responsible for that. So can I ask you, how much are we utilizing? We're going to be talking a lot about technology over the next couple of days here at Axios. How much are we utilizing independent technology or independent monitoring? I'm thinking of things like satellites to tackle this.
Technology is at the heart of what's going to make these rules work, and a law is only as good as the enforcement. So around this rule, actually this summer, we hosted a summit at the White House hosting all of these technology providers, as well as state regulators and then federal regulators and enforcers, so that everybody understands all the tools that are available. The rules are built using what is possible thanks to some of the more inventive technologies that are out there. For example, drone overflights that have helped folks spot leaks more effectively. And then in addition to that, belts and suspenders, we have deployed the NASA folks, including folks on the International Space Station, to help us verify our understanding of what's going on in terms of methane. One of the insights from all of this is actually baked into the rule, and that is that a small set of actors, a small set of wells are responsible for a very large set of emissions. Those are the super emitters of this super pollutant. This rule finalizes a focus on cracking down on that in particular. So I think technology is going to be key. And what we do with that data, enforcement is going to be key. We are on, I think, very strong posture to do that work.
And so when you're thinking, can you tell us a little bit more about details of enforcement and what the plan for that is and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to this federal effort to bring the data and technology tools to greater utilization, and we're working with state-level enforcers on this, This summer, the federal government launched an enforcement task force between the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior, where a lot of our public lands are managed, and the EPA to develop an enforcement strategy to make sure these rules are being followed. And then part of this is going to happen at the state level. I was just with Governor Lujan Grisham in New Mexico. There, they have already, under their state rules, gone out and delivered tens of millions of dollars of fines on companies that are skirting the rules that are already on the books. So here's how it's going to work. It's going to be this federal task force. It's going to be the state enforcement agencies. It's going to be transparency from civil society that is being called upon and now empowered because of this data environment. Those things are going to work in tandem. I have full confidence that these are rules that we're not just putting on the books and then on the shelf, that this is going to be a material reality for the oil and gas sector going forward.
So you talked earlier about the methane rule and how you feel like that's helping the U.S. sort of lead the way for other countries. Can you share a little bit about the IRA implementation and how you all see that playing, being influential on a global stage?
Look, everything that President Biden has done from day one, when he signed us back into the Paris Agreement, has been about driving bold U.S. leadership and leveraging that for mobilization all around the world. The methane play is one where the president took bold action at home, and the president was able to get 155 countries to come around. On the Inflation Reduction Act, the president signed it into law and then spent the rest of the year running around the world, including at the G20 and at the G7, encouraging other countries to take the IRA playbook and replicate it in their jurisdictions, and they have. So we've created, I think, thanks to the president's leadership, a real race to the top on clean energy, on the technologies in terms of both deployment and manufacturing. And then here's the other part. The deployment that happens in the U.S. de-risks this technology. By one estimate, the technology costs on some of the core decarbonizing tech that will be funded through the Inflation Reduction Act, it will help drive down the cost by 25%. That allows for greater deployment all around the world. Our sense is that for every ton we reduce in the U.S., 2 to 3 tons will be reduced overseas because of this de-risking effect. So President Biden's thesis that we can have bold leadership at home leveraged as persuasive diplomacy all around the world, I think is really working.
So I know your brief is you're the national climate advisor, but I just want to ask you a global question since we're here at COP. Do you feel like we are going to end this COP with a sense that we're in the right direction, but obviously the headline's going to be not enough?
Look, the Paris Agreement was set up to build transparency and accounting. The purpose of this conference of parties is to take stock of where we have traveled since we signed that agreement. And we all know, we can be clear-eyed about this, that the global stock take will deliver a very long to-do list for all of us to keep marching faster and faster in the direction of our climate goals. So I think hope and hopefulness has been vindicated. We have seen countries around the world take action. We've seen a bending of the curve through the commitments that have been made in Paris, and then subsequently from a over 5-6 degree trajectory to something much more in line with where we need to go. But there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that should be and will be the takeaway here. The big question I have is whether that takeaway will be more granular. Will we come together and think through implementation, as President Biden is in the United States, implementation on the global scale? What will we be doing to harness these new technologies more effectively, take out the barriers on financing and supply chain issues? How will we be working together coming out of this to put fossil fuel emissions in our rearview mirror once and for all? Those are the questions we're faced with. Hopefully, we'll make progress on that in this week.
This COP does seem like there's been a bit of a gravity shift to implementation, which then, of course, involves, as we get into the nitty gritty of this, more negotiation with private industry. How are you experiencing that? And do you feel like we're at the scale that we need to be at?
We're not at the scale we need to be at, but I think your observation's absolutely right. You know, we came into office, President signed us into the Paris Agreement. First COP we showed up, we said, trust us, we're going to pass this sweeping legislation. Everybody looked at us super skeptical. They said, really, you're going to pass a big bill, the biggest bill ever on climate? We said, sure we are. Then we went to Sharm el-Sheikh, and we had the receipts on passing the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law. We show up now with, in the United States, 32 gigawatts online of new solar just this year, with 100 factories announced in the U.S. since the Inflation Reduction Act to manufacture these products. So I think we are, not just us, but everybody shifting into this implementation phase. But I think we've still got to level up a lot if we're going to meet the moment. I just give you an example of the parts you need for the grid, right? Transformers, those HVDC wires and cables for subsea applications. We are bidding up the supply, but we're not expanding it rapidly enough to connect new power to the grid. It's not just in the US, it's all around the world. So I think we've got to get really aggressive about expanding manufacturing capacity in the next few years if we're going to meet our deployment targets in this decade and in the next one.
And as we think about getting aggressive about manufacturing, we have to have a conversation about workforce and workforce development. I know the president has a climate core initiative that he's launched. What are we thinking about raising? We are going to be talking a lot about green jobs over the next couple of days here at Axios House as well. What does that look like in the U.S. as we're thinking about creating a new generation of workers?
Number one, we've got to create pathways for everybody. College graduates, high school, none of the above. No matter where you're coming from, you should have a pathway into the clean energy workforce. That's number one. Number two, last year was the first year women outnumbered men in terms of new hires into the clean energy economy. We've got to make sure that this is an economy that is building right from the beginning things like paid leave and other policies that will allow more folks to be pulled into this workforce. If we're not fielding the full team, we're not meeting the moment. The third is that this has to be an opportunity to lean into worker power rather than pull away from it. And I think we've seen in the United States, right? The president set this bold target on electrification of transportation. That could have been the moment when we decided, hey, we're going to pull back on what our auto workers take home. But instead, we've seen record contracts be forged by the D3 and others, benefits go up, and job security go up. So this has got to be a workforce approach that brings everybody in, that makes it easier to retain folks in the workforce, and where we're lifting up wages and benefits. We have a roadmap and a playbook on how to do that. We just got to take it to scale.
What about I wonder about the cultural shift that you think might be required among our younger, like the kids who are just graduating from college now, who are looking at, as you know, we're also going to be talking a lot about AI and are feeling very discouraged and feeling like there's not going to be work for me. Like, I just wonder how you overcome that cultural shift to get that message across that you're trying to.
Yeah, look, we have to make sure people recognize the incredible need that we have, whether it's for the building trades, right? Literally constructing the future, whether it's for folks who will work in these factories, forging the materials and the products that we need to deploy all across the clean energy economy, or it's the folks who are inventing the next thing to help us decarbonize even more quickly. But I think part of this, and the president's done this so effectively, is to help people understand that there is incredible value and incredible need for jobs of all stripes. I think this is a moment of revitalization for blue-collar careers, green-collar, blue-collar careers. And the way I think we attract more people into this is exactly like the president's launch of the American Climate Corps, taking the barriers out, making the recruiting a centerpiece priority for the whole country. And if we do that, I think we get folks lining up because they're excited to build that more sustainable future.
Finally, Aliyah, so we're here in the UAE, and I wanted to ask as we convene in this Arab nation, the other topic that's dominated headlines apart from the climate, the Israel-Hamas war. You've been privy to many Biden administration meetings where Muslim and Arab American officials within the administration have expressed their disappointment at the public U.S. positions that have been taken. How much time are you spending on this now, these days?
You know, I think like so many of us, we tune into the news. This is something that we all have to collectively process. These are heavy issues and massive stakes. What gives me comfort is to be part of a White House team that's led by somebody who leads with empathy, who has deep schooling and expertise in this set of issues. I'm focused on climate change, on reducing our emissions, on lifting up people into good jobs, on pulling in communities that have been left behind. That's a pretty full plate. That's my day job and night job. But for all of us, I think, you know, we all have to grapple with the news of the day, with the big things that crowd our conscience. So we're focused on all of those things as people, but I think we've got pretty big stakes on the climate crisis. That's where I'm spending my time.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we
Thank
have
you.
for. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you so
with
much.
us. This is also we've been talking about the history that we're making here at Axios House. Well, this is the first time a FEMA administrator has come to COP. So we wanted to start with that idea of FEMA being a climate agency, and I wanted to welcome Administrator Deanne Quisserell to Axios House. I thought we would start with the lens. You wear a very particular hat here. As I've been over in Expo City, you know, you kind of see people who were looking at this from all of these different lenses of the climate puzzle. And I just wanted to ask what it's been like for you to be here at COP, because obviously your job is to respond to natural disasters, and I want to get into sort of how you've seen that change in the U.S. because of climate change. But just from that lens, what are your hopes for this conference? And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the UN Warnings for All initiative and how important you think that is.
Well, thank you, and it's really great to be here with everybody. You know, it's the first time a FEMA administrator, as you said, has come to COP, and I think that's a really important message. It really shows that the intersection between the changing climate and what we are doing in crisis management and consequence management are intrinsically linked. And we have to be able to continue to pay attention to the change and the severe weather events that we are continuing to see, and I think we'll get into that a little bit more. But also, you know, what can we do as a crisis management agency to get ahead of that curve so we're not always responding? And for me, it's been great to be able to connect with new partners. We've really launched a really proactive effort to try to integrate in with our international partners in the crisis management realm because we're all facing the same issues. But here I've had an opportunity to integrate in and connect with partners on the climate side that work with my colleagues in these other nations and have these conversations about how we need to stay connected and have joint conversations to build resilience against the threats and reduce the impacts and reduce the risks that these communities are facing.
Are you seeing that resilience as you're talking to colleagues from other countries? Like, where are their biggest pain points and challenges?
Well,
Is it like just as straightforward as warning systems?
Well, we can talk a lot about warning systems, but I would say the biggest pain point across the U.S. as well as with my colleagues across the globe is this repetitive cycle of response recovery,
Right.
recovery, and it's eating up all of our time and our effort and our resources when we know that we also need to commit those resources to putting in risk reduction projects and investing in mitigation. But for me, we have great resources at the federal level, but our state and local partners, if you're in an urban area, that's great. But if you are in the majority of America, the majority of the United States, you're working with a shop of one or two. And they're just in this continuous cycle. And when I talk to my colleagues across the globe, they're having the same challenges, having the same struggles of how do you balance the priorities of, you have to do the response and recovery, but you want to invest the time and the resources into building resilient communities. And if you want to talk about early warning, because the other part that's so important here is we don't have as much time to warn. And what we're seeing is that these storms are intensifying so rapidly. We can just talk about Acapulco, right? Recently, it went from a tropical wave to a Category 5 hurricane in 24 hours. And so our emergency managers have less time to warn people to take the actions that they need in order to protect themselves. We've built our plans on hurricane evacuation warnings starting 4
4 or 5 days out. Right.
We don't have that time anymore. And we're also seeing different types of threats. And so the early warning for all is such an important initiative. And I've had a chance to talk with many of my UN colleagues while I've been here about how we can continue to partner and share what we're doing in the US with developing nations as they're trying to implement programs to help reach more people and get that warning out there to save lives.
And so when we think about the places you have been across the U.S. just dealing with natural disasters, right? It's not just hurricanes. I'm thinking about just this past year, hurricanes, Florida, Georgia, floods in Alaska, of course, the wildfires in Hawaii. Is there a common thread? Is it the intensity? What are you seeing?
There's a lot of different threads.
When it comes to climate, how
I
about
know with that, though, it's, I did respond to the worst wildfire on Maui's history, but I just want you to know while I was flying out there to go assess the impacts of a wildfire on a tropical island, we were also preparing for a hurricane to hit the deserts of California. The first hurricane to potentially hit California in I forget how long. And so we're just seeing I think the biggest impact that we're seeing, I talked about the rapid intensification, but it's a continuous ops tempo. It's year-round events. And we used to build our staffing strategies around our peak busy season, which was the peak of hurricane season. We go from January 1 to December 31st with the same operational tempo. Just to put it in perspective, this year, couple stats, this year the U.S. has had 25 separate events that have accumulated more than $1 billion worth of damages. And I forget what the total number is, somewhere over $70 billion in total damages. For us, when it reaches a level that exceeds their capacity, we can do a disaster declaration. We are doing one every 3 days this year. That doesn't even count those that don't reach the threshold. So it's just continuous and putting more strain on our communities.
So when you're talking about putting that strain on a community, as someone who grew up in South Florida with hurricane warnings, one thing that strikes me, I think also everyone who grows in South Florida is kind of a weather nerd, and so I read like all of these forecasts, is the language is so stark in them, but it's almost every forecast. And do you worry about people taking that seriously when every forecast says this is a life-threatening event? And because it's just human nature, you just think, how could every one of these be a life-threatening event?
I absolutely worry about that because the complacency that we see is real. We can take Florida and use two hurricanes for an example. Hurricane Charlie, which I think was 2004, maybe, somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah, it was 2004. That was Francis Jean Charlie. Yeah.
It was a wind event that hit southwest Florida. And so as we were preparing for Hurricane Ian, everybody focuses on that cone, which is the wind impact. But what the 150 people that lost their lives in Ian, they drowned. And it was storm surge and rainfall. But we focus too much on the forecast and not communicating the risks. And even though we try to say, and that's why we use some of that language, this is life-threatening, non-livable storm surge, people still focus in on that cone and they don't see themselves in that. And so we have to figure out the better way to communicate the risk where people see themselves in it so they can take the appropriate actions. And one other piece that I really do just want to add there is when we ask people to evacuate, I think many of you will probably say the first thing that comes to mind is images of contraflow and long traffic lines trying to leave, going to state, people running out of fuel and food. In Ian, they only had to go 5 or 10 miles inland, and they would have been out of harm's way as the storm passed through. That's the kind of risk communication we have to pivot to.
I want to ask you about climate resilience, and in particular, the $50 million that you all announced in grants for 7 states and the District of Columbia this September. How did you pick those first 8 applicants? What are you hoping to happen there?
Is that with our storm fund?
For climate resilience, yeah.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of different programs that we are putting out there, and thanks to the Biden-Harris administration infusing additional funding into our mitigation programs, we've really been able to reach more people with this because our programs are all oversubscribed. This is the second iteration of that program. The first one were those states that were impacted by Hurricane Ida. When I first came in 2021. And so it's designed to go in and help these communities relocate homes or elevate homes so they can withstand future impacts. And the same criteria was used with the additional states of those that had recent, because this is a flood-related funding source, and those that had recent flooding events. So we could help protect those communities and help buy out more communities and move them into safe space, turn that into green space so it can't be developed again.
Administrator, I'm thinking of the Australian Prime Minister came to the White House recently and said he wanted to meet with you.
And he did.
So how often is that? And I wonder if I'm imagining you've been very popular here as well. Like, how often are we seeing that, though? FEMA working with other countries and working to help in this disaster preparedness across the globe?
Yeah, we're definitely increasing our footprint in that space. And it was great when he came to my office and we gave him a tour of our National Response Coordination Center and shared with him some of the things that we're doing, but also shared ideas of how we can advance emergency management because they have just launched recently a whole new approach to crisis management in Australia. And his director of crisis management, emergency management, my colleague, Brendan Moon, we have communicated frequently. We have met frequently to talk about how we can learn from each other. And we are continuing to do that outreach. I actually was able to meet with the Prime Minister of Greece the first day that I got here to talk about the same issues and how the things that he experienced this year with the wildfires and the floods in a way that they have never experienced them before are very similar to some of the things that we experienced in California. And how can we come in and help them better understand the tools that we use to help people be better prepared, but also to help mitigate against them. We're going to continue this outreach because we need to create that network of emergency managers. We need to build the network so we can talk to each other, share this critical information because we all have the same issues that we're facing.
And while I mentioned information sharing is critical, all of the things that we've talked about when we're talking about building climate resilience, having the staff to do disaster preparation, that requires a lot of money. So I wonder what about countries that just can't afford to do this?
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, we have some of those challenges within the U.S. with some of our much smaller rural communities, but other countries as well. And the one thing that we can do is we can come in and at least provide knowledge exchange. We can share information and use some of the tools that we have used to support some of our smaller, more rural communities and see if they apply to efforts and initiatives that they're putting in place. And something as simple, I'd love to share an example of our community emergency response teams. And we have this great program of local citizens, right, starting at the grassroots level and teaching them how to help each other. Because I always say that your neighbors are your first responders. They're the ones that are going to come knock on your door. They know who are the most vulnerable. And we've been able to take this curriculum into some of our South American countries and adapt it to their needs, not just translating, but truly adapting the program to meet the unique requirements within their communities, and then help them with a train the trainer so they can spread this information and really start to get and empower the local citizens to be engaged in resilience.
So, in the what keeps you up at night category, because I imagine in disaster preparation, I'm really curious about this, but what is your biggest worry for future FEMA directors?
Yeah, outside of the continuing threat that we're facing from climate change, I'm very concerned about the convergence of cyber attacks with our natural disasters, that our adversaries know when we are at our most vulnerable and know how to take advantage of those times. And so very concerned about this new threat landscape that is coming into our environment and creating challenges that we haven't faced before. And it goes into some of the misinformation as well. I can give you two examples that are making our jobs harder. In East Palestine, Ohio, when the train derailed, we had nation-state actors that were sending misinformation out, trying to create distrust in the federal government. In Maui, after the fires, we had nation-state actors that were sending misinformation.
And that's confirmed that's coming from outside.
Those were both confirmed instances that were coming from the outside. And it's creating so much difficulty for us to get people who really need our help to come ask us for the help, because it's created this level of distrust. So it's a whole new challenge that we have to face now as we're trying to do the right thing to help these people that have been impacted.
Right, so as you think about that, and as we wrap up here, I just wonder how you, like, we've sort of added another layer to challenge. Like, when you were sort of ranking all of the problems, like, where does that go in terms of cyber attacks versus, the natural disasters? Like, how do you prioritize all of that?
Oh, I don't know if I'm actually prioritizing it very well right now. I mean, we have so many challenges that we're being faced with. I will tell you what I am prioritizing, though, from my viewpoint, is we have the fortune to have a very large staff and a lot of really dedicated people. But my challenge is I need more capacity at the state and particularly the local level. And so from my efforts, I'm prioritizing trying to help them build that capacity so they can be able to take care of themselves and not rely on us as much.
Administrator Criswell, thank you so much for joining us here at
Thank you.
Axios
This
House.
was
We
great.
appreciate it. We'll stay right here. I'm just going to welcome up our publisher, who has an exciting interview for you next. Up next, our View from the Top moderator, Axios publisher Nicholas Johnston.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Like Nyla said, this is a huge, huge moment for Axios for many reasons that she did say, also for one that she didn't. It is Nyla's birthday. Happy birthday, Nyla. What a great place to celebrate it. But as she did say, this is Axios' very first event at COP. This is our very first event in Dubai, and none of that would be possible without the support of our partners. So a huge debt of gratitude to the folks at Mars Incorporated for making today possible. And so I want to welcome from Mars Incorporated up to the stage their Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability, Andy Farrow. Andy, welcome to Axios House. So let's start big picture. There's almost a sense of anxiety around the climate movement now. Political instability, economic uncertainty, inflation worldwide. Do you share that sense of anxiety? What is your mood?
I mean, it's been a very bad year for the world. It's been a bad year for the world economy, and it's certainly been a bad year for the environment. And if you look, we are living in the world's hottest year ever. So the business case for change is strong. The environmental case for change is strong, but I think not enough people get, and I think there is a choice between taking care of the economy and taking care of people and the environment. We did polling across the 7 largest economies, and we found that nearly 70% of people want companies to take as much action on the environment as they do on the economy. So I think we're here to say it's achievable. You can make progress. It's absolutely affordable, but it's absolutely necessary.
It's almost like viewing it's not an either-or proposition. You have to think about both as crises that the world is facing.
Yeah, I mean, business doesn't have much of a future in a completely unsustainable world. The impacts of the environment on business are very profound, and also, business isn't an abstract. It's made up of people.
So let's narrow the focus now into Mars Incorporated. You've released publicly your net zero roadmap. What's the idea behind that? Was trying to public source, open source it?
Well, we're not a conference of the party. We're not a party, but actually, perhaps we could be. I mean, we have a greenhouse gas footprint of the size of Finland, and so we're the size of a small country in terms of our impact. We've published a roadmap to essentially to halve our impact by 2030, and we've made good progress towards that. We're now 8 percentage point. We're 8% down from our baseline, 15 points down from our peak in 2018. But of Finland, as we are, only 4% is in our direct operations. Over 90% is outside. So we can't do it alone. And so why do we publish it? We publish it to I suppose, to show it's possible, to invite others on the journey, and frankly to galvanize support and request their help on this sort of global movement to get it down.
I mean, just like you said, it's like you couldn't do it on your own because there's too many partners and suppliers also involved, just as the same way a country like Finland couldn't do it on its own. And so I think sharing it openly is kind of a sense of trying to make it more of a community effort then.
It is. We also had perhaps quite a rare thing, which is an environmental report with numbers in it. So we actually break down, strategy by strategy, what we can achieve and by when, and really providing a real business focus to how we're making progress.
Well, let's dig into that. If you want to go through some of the specifics over the next 5-10 years, what milestones are you looking at? How do you measure that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a view that there isn't a trade-off between profit and purpose, and that we want to demonstrate what's possible for a responsible business. We have 7 shareholder objectives. 2 of them relate directly to the environment. 1 of them relates to trust, and then we embed that completely throughout our business. So just a month ago, we were sitting with all our business units, and we were looking at their business plans for the next 5 years, and those business plans aren't just about the how they will do financially. They're about where they will specifically be on greenhouse gas emissions, where they will specifically be on plastics, and the capital is allocated for them. So I can tell you over the next 3 years, we will put $2.7 billion into sustainability. It's factored in, it's into the plans, and so with that you get quite a lot of detail behind it, and it's really embedded. Then I suppose on the environmental side, then you'll say things like zero deforestation. Deforestation is, we have by a lot in agriculture. Deforestation. So you look, strategy by strategy. We're about 60% renewable energy, electricity already. We've had our first fuel-free plant this year. We'll have another 5 come on stream. So you'll see the very specifics, but very detailed plans.
You have detailed plans. You have business leaders writing, implementing those detailed plans. How do you incentivize them to follow through with that?
It's in their pay. I mean,
that's an easy answer.
The most significant incentive scheme for our top 300 leaders, and in that, 40% of it relates to greenhouse gas emissions, plastic recycling, and trust. So it's very there, it's very real, it's very tangible. You have to incentivize. If you don't normalize the environment into a core business metric that you want to drive success against, it becomes a hope.
So among those 300 leaders, to narrow on that, because I think that's very interesting, is that they are hitting business targets, revenue targets, profit targets, and being incentivized on that. There are also specifically those kinds of sustainability targets in there, and they will get money if they hit those.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's the biggest element of many of our senior leaders' pay.
There's an element along a lot of climate conversation is the difference between commitment and achievement, right? Is there a sense of commitment fatigue? How do you beyond, or what kind of broader strategies are there to bridge that gap? It's easy to talk the talk. How do you walk the walk?
I mean, you walk the walk by embedding, measuring, and reporting annually against it. You don't judge the financial performance of a company on what they tell the analysts it's going to be in the year ahead. And you shouldn't judge the environmental performance of a company on where they say they'll be in 2050. So very much our focus is on what are the actuals we can deliver, and you should judge our CEO, me, and our leadership team much more on where we get to in 2030, because that's in our life cycle as leaders. And as I said, we are down. Our business has grown 60% since 2015, and our carbon emissions are 8% lower, 15 points lower than the peak in 2018. So we think it is absolutely possible to do it with providing you have the right focus.
Let's take one last big picture question before we wrap it up. Here at COP, what is the messaging? How can an event like this help you in this goal? Is it important to be able to say this in front of policy leaders, to keep the pressure on, to keep the narrative going? What's the big takeaway from a couple weeks here?
The big takeaway, and the thing that I think that we're most pleased about, is that nature and agriculture is on the agenda in a way that it wasn't 3 or 4 years ago. And so making sure that we don't just focus on the energy transition. Energy transition is incredibly important, but nature and the environment is important. We're also looking, to find partners and to actually galvanize other companies in terms of driving support.
I mean, the conversation is becoming broader. It's not just about energy generation, but all pieces of a production life cycle that fits in, I think, which is what you're
that's what I'm saying. I mean, 80% of our footprint is in agriculture or land use change.
It's important to look at that and have a big platform for that. All right,
Yeah.
We're about to get the hook here. In the minute we have left, Axios has to end on one fun thing. We're going to make that one Dubai thing. This is our first trip, my first trip. You were an old hand. You told me 50 times you've been to Dubai. So for
Probably 40.
For our new folks, what do we do while we're here? Don't miss what?
There are fabulous beaches, there are wonderful restaurants, but I would really say get out into the desert and really see the beauty that is there.
Great tip. That's my plan for tomorrow. Andy, thanks so much for being here, and thanks to Mars Incorporated for making today happen.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior climate reporter Andrew Friedman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our terribly located space. I'm Andrew Friedman, Senior Climate Reporter for Axios. Let's get straight to it. I'm really excited to introduce this next guest to bring to you a different perspective on the climate issue. He's a vital voice for Pacific Island nations. He's the AOS's chair and Samoa's Minister of Natural Resources and Environment. The Honorable Minister Schuster is joining me. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So my first question is, what do you want this audience to know about small island states and their vulnerability to climate change?
Thank you. I think if you're not aware of the small island state, a lot of people have been to the Caribbean, and you hear of a lot of the cyclones and the impacts. Sea level rise affects tourism in those areas. Within the Pacific, we have islands that, just like the Caribbean, as temperatures rise and sea level rise, it affects not just the person, but our economies. Because we're small island developing states, if nothing is done, then some of our countries will lose everything. And when we experience a cyclone or a natural disaster or climate-related event, it affects the national economy. In other countries, you can get away with parts of the country affected, whereas for us, it puts the country development back another 10 or 15 years.
What are you looking for from a Dubai agreement that would better secure your country's future and the future of other small island states?
Well, the Paris Agreement, as we know, this one of the bigger issues for us this time is the global stocktake. And the global stocktake, we expect to help shape and to help identify and sets out a plan on how we can address the climate change issue, especially for us, is keeping the 1.5 degree issue alive. Because if not, we will have bigger, more devastating impacts and catastrophic, especially for small island developing states.
So I noticed you're wearing a 1.5 pin. Never mind that it was upside down. Never mind. You're wearing a 1.5 pin. The COP president has been under a microscope this entire time, and he got into some trouble on the 1.5 degree issue, which he addressed in a press conference today. But I'm curious whether or not you're questioning his commitment to actually getting that goal reached, considering what he said and considering what his country and company are doing.
We're here to make sure that we collectively, as a global community, work together. And we're here to listen and relay our message to the global community, different countries, that we want to work with you. All the different options need to be on the table so that we can look at a future that doesn't go above 1.5, including different perspectives, different countries. But as I said, our main goal is to keeping the 1.5 alive, and that is by looking at ensuring that this COP decision comes out that will ensure through the GST that we have peaking the global emissions by 2025 and starting to curve by 2030. So, and we get to a net zero by 2050. If the different plans that can be put together to ensure this goal is reached will be comforting for us.
But do you question at all his commitment to ensuring that type of agreement gets done, based on what you heard come out yesterday?
It's been 30 years for the small island developing states, and since the UNFCCC started, and there's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of issues, but we're here committed to continuing to fight now, continuing to make our voices heard, continuing to relate to the global community what needs to be done. Everyone has a different perspective, but all we can do is continue to emphasize the issue.
Very diplomatic. Can you talk about how it, speaking of 30 years, can you talk about how it feels to have the loss and damage agreement adopted after so many years of advocating for this? This was an idea that originated in small island developing states, I believe, specifically Vanuatu. But I could be wrong about that. So, after 30 years of work getting that done on the first day of COP, I'm curious as to how that struck you and how that set the tone for these negotiations.
Well, trying to get it on the agenda and getting it approved at Sharm el-Sheikh was a big victory for a lot of small island developing countries and developing countries with special conditions. And the speed that it took from Sharm el-Sheikh to the TC5 this year and getting it endorsed and capitalized as one of the first agenda items is a great victory. And not just for small island developing states, it's for the global community. Because this is a recognition of the impacts that we are dealing with now. And just to say that the loss and damage, this shows how gravely affected the small island developing states and the least developing countries are at. Because right now, we are dealing with the impacts, the loss and damage on a daily basis. So adaptation, mitigation, we're still trying to get there, but we are getting, example, Vanuatu as a country you mentioned. 3 cyclones, category 5 cyclones in 9 months. That devastates the country. We get coral bleaching, a whole economy of a country that relies on fisheries and inshore fisheries, both domestic and commercial economic development. So these are issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis. So to answer your question, loss and damage fund is great, but we need to operationalize it quickly. So again, we have easily accessible mechanisms. What we've experienced in the past is through the GCF and other financial mechanisms. Yes, it's great, but it takes 10 years to develop a proposal. And by the time it gets to a small island, the issues have gone past. And the implementation also, a lot of the mechanisms that are made available means that if you get a $10 million project, probably 10% or less actually reaches the actual communities that are affected.
What do you think about the adequacy of the pledges that have so far come forward for the loss and damage fund? So if folks here weren't keeping very close tabs on the loss and damage negotiations at the first couple of days, we had a relatively small contribution come forward from the United States. It was maybe, if you're looking at the global community, maybe slightly embarrassing. We had, a $100 million pledge from elsewhere, but it's tiny compared to the scale of what is actually needed to address this situation. Do you feel like there's enough momentum moving forward on this now? Or is this something that's going to complicate things, maybe something that your alliance of countries and others will push for more in the next week?
Well, our goal, our want, our ask is to have 100 billion for the loss and damage fund on an annual basis. Now, if you compare to the pledges that have come through, we're nowhere near that. We also got the 100 billion that was anticipated on an annual basis to help with climate financing. Those have not been realized as of today. There's a lot of talk that we might have reached it, but the clear evidence, we're waiting for that. So to answer your question, we're nowhere near, as you identified. The losses that have been estimated and the financing that needs to be available is in the trillions to be able to adequately address climate change issues.
Can you, I'd imagine not very many people in this audience have been to your country. I have not. I would like very much to do so.
You might know Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Yes, there is that. Who, according to polls, if he runs for president, would actually win. So I'm curious if you can leave our audience with some sense of the essence of your country and, culturally what's at stake and how climate change is already manifesting there from things that you can see almost on a daily basis.
I'll speak for myself. 10 years ago, my grandparents' house was next to the beach. Now, 100 meters inland, the whole coast, the whole village is eroded. Everyone has to find new land somewhere else. So on the fishing, they used to be dependent on domestic fisheries for livelihood, 70% of the animal protein from fisheries. Now, with a lot of coral bleaching, that's rarely available. So you have to find different alternatives for sustenance. And we start depending on imports. And the more imports, the higher the cost of living. So the household economy gets affected. on a yearly basis, during this time from October to February, it's a cyclone season. So you're constantly living aware of heavy rains, cyclones. Once you move out of that, you get into the dry season. Then you start worrying about droughts. And in between that, you have heavy rains and flooding, landslides. These are issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis, as well as economic impact on for schooling, for health. I heard someone mention agriculture. The changing in the agriculture to provide because of the weather patterns, the weather changes in the weather patterns. We have to change the growing. It becomes less months of the year to do growing. And the technology might be available in developed countries, but that technology doesn't reach us.
Well, I want to thank you for coming here and providing this essential perspective. I want to, wish you good luck with the further negotiations and the possible all-nighters it may involve.
Already.
Yeah, there you go. And we'll see you with the Global Stock Take draft that should be out tomorrow, although we had expected it yesterday. So I just encourage people to keep this perspective in mind as these negotiations go forward regarding what's at stake, what countries are at stake, and truly what nations are the moral voice of these negotiations. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. And I will now adjourn this session. Thank you. All right, thank you. Please do stick around, invite friends. The next discussions are going to be great. I'm personally really looking forward to them, and thank you.